The sun over the town of Redemption was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth of the main street until the dust itself seemed to bake. It was a heat that warped the air, making the clapboard storefronts shimmer like apparitions and driving any sensible soul into the shade. But on this day, sense had fled Redemption, leaving a thirst uglier than any drought could conjure. In the center of the street, a mob had formed, a tight knot of men whose faces were flushed with whiskey and a righteous cruelty. Their righteousness was aimed at the girl. She was Apache. That was her crime. Her name was Anawa, though no one in the crowd knew or cared to know it. They saw only the dark hair, the high cheekbones, the buckskin dress that was now torn at the shoulder. They had dragged her from the trading post where she'd come with her grandfather to trade pelts for flour and medicine. The old man lay now by the water trough, a bloody stillness where a proud elder had stood moments before. The town marshal, a man named Withers, whose spine was as yellow as his teeth, watched from the comfort of his porch, a silent blessing to the proceedings. Ethan Cross saw it all from the shade of the livery stable. He wasn't a man who sought trouble. Trouble had a way of finding him, clinging to him like the dust on his worn leather chaps. He had ridden into Redemption for a bag of coffee and a fresh horseshoe, intending to be gone before sundown, a ghost passing through. He carried the weight of a past he couldn't outrun, a failure etched so deep into his soul that solitude had become his only penance. His gaze was hard, his face a mask of stoicism carved by wind and regret. He watched the men circle Anawa, their taunts like stones, their hands reaching. They ripped another piece of her dress, and the sound tore through the oppressive heat, a sound more violent than a gunshot. Anawa did not scream. Her chin was high, her back straight. In her dark eyes wasn't the fear they craved, but a bottomless contempt that infuriated them further. She was a lone pine on a windswept ridge, refusing to bend to their storm. Her quiet defiance was her strength, a hidden well of power they could not touch. But Ethan saw the tremor in her hands, the slight quiver of her lip. He saw her humanity, and in it, he saw a reflection of the innocence he had once failed to protect. A big-bellied man, Jedediah Kane, the blacksmith whose grudge against the Apache was a local legend, shoved her forward. "Dance for us, savage! Dance for the good folk of Redemption!" The laughter that followed was jagged and vile. They stripped the sleeve from her other shoulder, exposing her skin to the scorching sun. She stumbled, and for the first time, her composure cracked. A single silent tear carved a path through the grime on her cheek. And that was the moment something broke in Ethan Cross. The ghosts of his past rose up, screaming in the silent chambers of his heart. He had stood by once before, a lifetime ago, and watched injustice unfold. He had done nothing, and the price of that inaction had been a piece of his soul. He would not pay it again. He stepped out from the shadows of the livery. The sun hit him, but he didn't feel its heat. The only fire was the one burning in his gut. He didn't shout. He didn't draw attention to himself. He simply walked with a steady, deliberate pace to the center of the street. His hand fell to the Colt at his hip, the worn walnut grip familiar and solid. The crowd, drunk on their power, barely noticed him until he was 20 feet away. Jedediah Kane turned, a sneer on his thick lips. "Well, look what we have here. A lone rider looking to join the fun?" Ethan's gaze wasn't on Kane, it was on the girl. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. He saw her flicker of surprise, the question in her deep, dark eyes. His own face remained a mask, but his message was clear. He raised the Colt Peacemaker, the barrel pointing not at any man, but at the empty, indifferent blue sky. The motion was fluid, economical, deadly. He didn't hesitate. The gunshot was a deafening crack that shattered the afternoon. It wasn't a sound of aggression, but of declaration. It was a full stop at the end of a sentence of hate. Birds scattered from the rooftops. The jeering laughter died in the throats of the mob, replaced by a stunned, ringing silence. Every head turned toward him. The collective bloodlust of the crowd, once focused on Anawa, now swirled and redirected, a predator finding new prey. Jedediah Kane's sneer curdled into a mask of pure fury. He saw not a man, but a challenge to his authority, a rejection of the town's brutal law. "You just made a mistake, stranger," Kane growled, his hand slowly moving toward his own pistol. Ethan didn't flinch. He lowered the smoking barrel of his Colt, his thumb resting on the hammer, his knuckles white. He had fired a shot to stop them. But in that ringing silence, under the judgment of that merciless sun, Ethan Cross knew he hadn't ended the hunt. He had just become the hunted. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the alleyway behind him, a silent command to the girl. "Run." The alley was a narrow gut between the general store and the assayer's office, choked with refuse and the stench of rot. It was their only way out. Ethan didn't wait for Kane's next move. He grabbed Anawa's arm, his touch firm but not rough, and pulled her with him, away from the stunned circle of men. The spell was broken. A furious roar erupted from the street as they plunged into the shadows of the alley. "Get him!" Kane's voice boomed, thick with rage. "He ain't leaving this town." Splinters exploded from a wooden crate beside Ethan's head as the first shot from the mob rang out. He didn't look back. His only focus was the girl and the open land he hoped lay beyond the town's squalid embrace. Anawa ran with a surprising agility, her bare feet sure-footed on the filth-strewn ground. She didn't cry out or stumble. The quiet strength he had seen in the street was now a fierce, silent will to survive. The torn buckskin dress, a mark of her humiliation, now seemed a banner of defiance as she matched his pace. They burst out of the alley's far end, behind the buildings, where the town frayed into scrubland. Ethan's horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Pilgrim, was still tied at the livery. There was no time. The posse was already fanning out, their shouts echoing as they organized the hunt. He saw Kane pointing, directing his men with the cold efficiency of a wolf pack leader. "This way," Ethan said, his voice a low rasp. It was the first time he had spoken to her. He led them west, away from the main trails and into the badlands, a jagged, broken country of canyons and arroyos that the devil himself seemed to have designed in a fit of pique. The ground was treacherous, littered with loose rock and thorny brush that tore at their clothes and skin. The sun, their enemy in the street, was now a relentless torturer. It beat down on them, stealing the moisture from their bodies, punishing them for their flight. For hours. They moved in a punishing silence, broken only by the scrape of their boots, their ragged breaths, and the distant baying shouts of the posse that occasionally drifted on the hot wind. Ethan pushed a brutal pace, his long strides eating up the harsh terrain. He was driven by more than just the fear of the mob. He was driven by the ghosts that rode with him. Every step was an act of atonement. He glanced back at Anawa. Her face was a mask of exhaustion, her lips cracked, but her eyes were constantly scanning the landscape. She was reading the terrain, noting the direction of the sun, the shape of the rock formations. She was not just following, she was surviving. The fragile alliance between them was forged not in words, but in shared hardship. When they paused in the meager shade of a rock outcropping, he unslung his canteen. He drank first, a short, disciplined swallow, before handing it to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and drank with the same restraint. She handed it back, her eyes meeting his for a moment, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between them. No words were needed. He was the protector, the one with the gun and the grit. She was the survivor, the one with the knowledge of this unforgiving land. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, the temperature dropped, but the danger did not. The posse would have horses. They would cover ground faster. Ethan knew they needed a place to hide, a place where they could not be easily tracked. He was a capable outdoorsman, but this was Apache land. He was an intruder here. He scanned the labyrinth of canyons before them, a maze of shadow and stone. A wrong turn could trap them, leading them to a dead end or a sheer cliff face. It was Anawa who stopped him. She put a hand on his arm, the first time she had initiated contact. Her touch was light, but it held a certainty that made him pause. She pointed not towards the larger, more obvious canyon mouth, but to a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the rock face, a crack barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. It was hidden by a thick growth of greasewood and looked like nothing more than a shadow. Her eyes held his, questioning if he would trust her. The shouts of the posse seemed closer now, echoing unnervously in the twilight. Cain would be relentless. He would not stop until he had his vengeance. Ethan looked from the dark fissure back to Anawa's determined face. He saw the memory of the torn dress, the defiance in her gaze. He had made a choice in the street, a choice to trust his own moral compass. Now, he had to make another. He had to trust her. He nodded once, and without a word, followed her into the dark. Hidden crack in the stone. The wilderness had become their only sanctuary, and every shadow, every sound, tested the fragile bond between the stoic cowboy and the silent Apache girl. The fissure was a tight squeeze, the rough sandstone walls scraping at their clothes and skin as they moved sideways through the passage. It felt like descending into the earth's gullet. After 20 yards, the passage opened abruptly into a small, hidden canyon, a secret fold in the badlands. It was no more than 50 yards across, with sheer walls rising 100 feet on 3 sides. A trickle of water, barely a whisper, seeped from a rock face, pooling in a shallow basin before disappearing into the sand. A lone, twisted juniper tree stood sentinel at its center. It was a place of profound silence, insulated from the outside world. The sounds of the posse were gone, swallowed by the stone. For the first time since fleeing redemption, they could stop. The tension that had held them rigid for hours began to seep away, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. Ethan slid down the canyon wall, his back against the cool rock, the Colt still resting in his hand. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind the familiar ache of his old life, the constant, low-grade pain of memory. He watched Anawa as she knelt by the seep, cupping the cool, clear water in her hands and drinking deeply. She then splashed the water on her face and the raw, red welts on her shoulders where the sun had burned her exposed skin. The moon rose, a silver disk in the dark sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the canyon floor. The world was reduced to silver and black. Ethan finally holstered his pistol. The immediate threat had passed. For now. He gathered a few dry branches from the base of the ancient juniper, the wood snapping loudly in the stillness. He built a small, smokeless fire, a circle of warmth and light no bigger than a dinner plate, tucked away in an alcove where its glow would be invisible from above. They sat on opposite sides of the tiny fire, the flames dancing in their eyes. The silence was different now. It was no longer the tense, watchful silence of the flight, but something deeper, more contemplative. It was a silence that invited whispers. Ethan stared into the flames, but he wasn't seeing the fire. He was seeing a different fire. Years ago, a farmhouse burning against a black prairie sky. He heard the screams he had been too late to answer. It was the source of the cross he bore, the failure that had sent him wandering. He had been a deputy then, young and full of conviction. He'd been warned of a raid, a retaliatory strike born of a land dispute, but he had been slow, hesitant. He'd tried to reason where force was needed. By the time he'd acted, the smoke was already on the horizon. A family, a man, his wife, their 2 young daughters, lost to a senseless, brutal violence he might have prevented. He had never worn a badge again. "They're called the Lowry brothers," he said, his voice quiet, rough with disuse. He wasn't sure why he was speaking, only that the silence demanded it. "The men I failed to stop. I see their faces sometimes, in crowds." He looked over at Anawa, her profile serene and still in the firelight. "When I saw what those men were doing to you, I saw them again." He didn't expect a response. He was speaking more to the ghosts than to her. He was unburdening a piece of a story he had never told another living soul. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Anawa watched him, her dark eyes holding a depth of understanding that startled him. She had seen the ghosts in his eyes back in the street. Now she heard their names. She saw the man behind the stoic mask, a man not so different from her own people, haunted by loss, scarred by the cruelty of others. She shifted slightly, pulling the tattered remnants of her buckskin dress tighter around her shoulders. The firelight caught the smooth line of her jaw, the proud set of her chin. Her lips parted, and a sound, soft as a moth's wing, entered the space between them. "Anawa," she said. Ethan looked up, confused for a moment. "What?" She met his gaze directly, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than pain or defiance was in her eyes. It was an offering. "My name," she whispered, her voice husky but clear, "is Anawa." It was a single word, but it was a bridge. It crossed the vast, silent chasm that had separated them. It was not just a name, it was a recognition of his humanity, an answer to his own vulnerability. He had given her a piece of his past, and she had given him her name. In the sanctuary of the hidden canyon, surrounded by the ghosts of the West, a gunslinger and an Apache girl had taken the first fragile step away from being just a protector and his charge. They were Ethan and Anawa. And that, in this harsh and unforgiving world, was everything. Jedediah Kane was not a man easily deterred. While his posse grew discouraged as the tracks vanished into the labyrinthine badlands, Kane's resolve only hardened, crystallizing into a shard of pure, cold hatred. He dismounted from his big roan horse at the edge of the rock field where Ethan and Anawa's trail had disappeared. His men muttered behind him, thirsty and tired, their whiskey-fueled bravado having long since evaporated under the relentless sun. "They're gone, Jed," one of them whined, wiping a grimy sleeve across his forehead. "Could be anywhere. Best we head back." Kane turned, and the look in his eyes silenced the man instantly. It wasn't just the anger of a thwarted bully. It was something deeper, more personal. "You go back if you want. Cobb. The rest of us are seeing this through." His gaze swept over the broken land, not with the uncertainty of his men, but with the grim patience of a seasoned hunter. This was not about town justice. For Kane, this was about an old and bitter wound. Years ago, his younger brother, blinded by arrogance, had tried to claim a stretch of Apache land, believing a piece of paper from a distant government meant more than generations of ancestral right. The Apache had warned him. He hadn't listened. They found him a week later, his horse gone, his rifle broken, and his pride shattered, left to walk 30 miles back to redemption, a living symbol of foolishness. The Apache hadn't killed him. They had merely shamed him, and in Kane's mind, that was a greater sin. The girl, Anawa, was of that same tribe. To him, her face held the same quiet contempt, the same infuriating dignity that he saw as arrogance. Ethan's intervention wasn't just the act of a meddling stranger. It was a defense of the very people who had humiliated his family name. It was a grudge he intended to settle in blood. He knelt, his thick fingers tracing the edge of a scuffed boot print on a patch of hard soil. "He's clever," Kane grunted to himself. "Stuck to the rock, but they can't fly." He scanned the cliff faces, his eyes narrowed, searching for any sign, any disturbance. He was a tracker of uncommon skill, a man who read the land not as a landscape, but as a story of passage. He saw the single displaced pebble, the freshly broken stalk of a creosote bush. He walked the perimeter of the rock field for nearly an hour, his obsession a palpable force that even his weary men dared not question. And then he found it, a single, long strand of dark hair, snagged on the thorny branch of a mesquite bush near the hidden fissure. He held it up, a triumphant, ugly sneer twisting his lips. "Found you," he whispered. Inside the hidden canyon, a fragile peace had settled. Ethan had managed to shoot a rabbit with a carefully aimed shot from his Colt, the sound muffled by the canyon walls. They had cooked it over the small fire, the shared meal solidifying their unspoken bond. He was cleaning his pistol, the familiar ritual a source of comfort, when Anawa suddenly went rigid. She stood up, her head cocked, listening to something he could not hear. A vibration in the stone, a shift in the wind. "They are close," she breathed, her voice tight with alarm. Ethan was on his feet in an instant, the half-assembled pistol in his hand. He scrambled up the loose scree at the canyon's side, peering over the rim. His heart sank. Below, not more than half a mile away, was the posse. They were dismounted, and Kane was at their head, pointing directly toward their hiding spot. He hadn't found them by chance. He had tracked them. This was a hunter who would not give up. "We have to go," Ethan said, sliding back down into the canyon. Now. There was no time for deliberation. They kicked dirt over the fire, grabbed the canteen, and scrambled toward the canyon's only other exit, a steep, treacherous game trail that wound its way up the far wall. It was a desperate, high-stakes climb, exposed and dangerous. Halfway up, loose shale gave way under Ethan's boot. He slid, his body slamming against the rock face, his grip on his reassembled Colt lost. The pistol clattered down the slope, coming to rest in the brush far below. He was unarmed. Below them, Kane and his men had entered the canyon. "There they are," a man shouted, pointing up at the trail. Kane raised his rifle, the setting sun glinting off the long barrel. "Nowhere left to run. Cross," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. A bullet whizzed past Ethan's head, chipping stone from the cliff face. The chase was no longer a distant threat. It was immediate and lethal. Trapped on the side of a cliff, with a relentless hunter below and an unknown wilderness above, their fragile sanctuary had become a death trap. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to grip Ethan. He was exposed on the cliffside, his only weapon now lying useless in the canyon below. Kane's men were spreading out, finding firing positions. Another shot ricocheted nearby, closer this time. They were being pinned down, a prelude to an execution. But Anawa didn't panic. Her face, illuminated by the dying light, was a mask of intense focus. This was her land, the rocks, the sky, the wind. They were the pages of a book she had known since birth. She grabbed his sleeve, her grip surprisingly strong, and pulled him upward, away from the path of the bullets. "The sky," she said, her voice urgent as she pointed not up, but west, toward the horizon. Ethan looked, the sky he had seen just moments before as a clear, tranquil orange was now bruised with a deep, angry purple along the distant mountain peaks. The air had grown heavy, thick with a strange, electric stillness. There was no thunder, no lightning, just a menacing silence. He was a plainsman. He knew the signs of a prairie storm, but this was different. This was the fury of the canyons. A flood, he breathed, understanding dawning in his eyes. It will be fast, she confirmed, her gaze flicking back down at Kane, then to the narrow canyon floor below. They are in the throat of it. It was a terrifying gamble, but it was their only one. Instead of continuing up the treacherous trail, Anawa reversed course, scrambling horizontally across the cliff face with a speed and confidence that defied the danger. She moved toward a section of the wall that seemed impassable, a sheer drop. Ethan followed, his mind racing. He had to trust her completely now. His strength, his gun, his experience, they were all worthless here. Her knowledge was their only salvation. They reached a narrow ledge, barely a foot wide, tucked under a large overhang. "Here," she commanded, pressing herself flat against the rock. "Hold." Below, Kane saw them stop. He mistook their maneuver for surrender. "Nowhere to go, girl!" he shouted, a triumphant laugh echoing in the unnaturally still air. "It's over." He took his time, raising his rifle for a final, killing shot. And then the sound came. It wasn't the crack of a rifle, but a low, deep rumble that seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself. It grew rapidly into a deafening roar. Kane and his men looked upriver, their faces turning from triumphant to confused, then to horrified. A wall of brown water, churning with uprooted trees and debris, was surging down the narrow canyon. The distant storm had unleashed its payload, and the badlands were funneling its rage into this single, narrow channel. The flash flood hit them with the force of a locomotive. The posse's shouts were swallowed by the roar of the water. Men and horses were tossed like dolls, swept away in the torrent of mud and rock. The canyon floor where they had stood just seconds before was now a raging, violent river. From their precarious perch on the ledge, Ethan and Anawa watched the cataclysm unfold. The sheer power of it was mesmerizing and terrifying. The floodwaters rose with shocking speed, churning just 30 feet below them. They were safe, but trapped. Ethan looked at Anawa. Her face was grim, her knuckles white where she clung to the rock. But her eyes held a spark of fierce, unyielding life. She had saved them. She had read the signs and turned the land itself into a weapon against their pursuers. He looked at his own hands, empty and powerless. He had come into this as the protector, the gunslinger who would save the helpless girl. But in the heart of the wilderness, their roles had been completely reversed. He was the one who was helpless, and she, with her quiet strength and deep connection to this place, was the one who had ensured their survival. A debt had been paid, not with words, but with life itself. As the roar of the flood began to subside, leaving behind a canyon scoured clean and filled with an eerie silence, Ethan knew their bond had been reforged in the fury of the water. They were no longer protector and protected. They were survivors, equals, bound together by the shared breath of a life she had given back to him. The flood receded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a world remade. The canyon floor was a ruin of mud, slick rock, and the debris of the storm, of Kane and his posse. There was no sign. They had been erased, washed away by the very land they sought to conquer. An eerie quiet settled, broken only by the dripping of water and the mournful whistle of the wind through the canyon. For 2 days, they remained on the ledge, waiting for the ground to firm up, subsisting on the last of their meager supplies. The shared ordeal had stripped away any remaining artifice between them. They spoke little, but their silence was comfortable. companionable. Ethan watched her, marveling at her resilience. Anawa, in turn, saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the deep weariness that went beyond their current plight. She saw the weight of the past he carried, and understood that fleeing, even successfully, had not lightened it. On the third morning, they climbed down to the transformed canyon floor. Ethan's first instinct was to search for his Colt, but a quick look at the chaos of rock and mud told him it was a fool's errand. It was gone. His identity as a gunslinger, the one tangible piece of his old life, was buried. He felt strangely unmoored, but also lighter. "We should keep moving west," he said, his voice practical. "Put as much distance as we can between us and this." He gestured vaguely to the east, towards redemption. The logical plan was to disappear, to find a new life somewhere in the vast, anonymous territories. Anawa was looking east, her expression unreadable. "And then what? Ethan Cross?" she asked, her voice soft but piercing. "Run until the sky ends? There is always another redemption. There is always another Cain." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. She was right. He had been running for years, not just from the law or from enemies, but from himself. He ran from the memory of the Lowry farm, from the faces of the daughters he couldn't save. He had thought his action in redemption was a stand, a moment of redemption. But what good was it if he simply fled the consequences? It was just another form of running. He would carry the ghost of Anawa's rescue just as he carried the ghosts of his past failure, another heavy stone in his soul. "He may not be dead," Anawa continued, her gaze steady and unwavering. "A man with that much hate in his heart is hard to kill. He will go back. He will tell them you murdered those men. He will twist the story until you are the monster, and I am the excuse." She was giving voice to the fear that had been gnawing at him. Cain, or men like him, would control the narrative. The truth of what happened in the street, the cruelty, the injustice, would be buried deeper than his lost pistol. It would be replaced by a lie, a convenient story that justified their hatred. Ethan's act of defiance would become a crime. Anawa's survival would become an outrage. The cycle of violence would not be broken. It would just be given a new, stronger foundation. A profound shift occurred within Ethan. It was a quiet, internal reckoning. He looked at his empty holster, then at Anawa. She was no longer a victim he had to protect, but a partner whose wisdom cut to the very heart of his own brokenness. To run would be to dishonor her strength and to fail himself yet again. The only true path to redemption wasn't to be found at the end of a trail heading west. It was back in the place where it all began. "You're right," he said, the words feeling strange and momentous on his tongue. He took a breath, and for the first time in years, it felt full and clear. The weight on his shoulders wasn't gone, but it had changed. It was no longer just a burden to be carried. It was a responsibility to be met. "We can't outrun it. We have to face it." Anawa searched his face, seeing the change in him, the new resolve hardening his features. She saw that his decision wasn't born of recklessness, but of a newfound clarity. She gave a single, slow nod. "I will not hide," she said. "My truth is not a thing to be ashamed of." The decision was made. It was illogical. It was dangerous. It was likely a death sentence, but it felt more right than anything Ethan had done in years. They turned their backs on the setting sun, the traditional direction of escape and new beginnings. Together, unarmed and with nothing but the truth as their shield. They began the long walk back east, back to the town of redemption. They were no longer fleeing. They were returning to confront their demons and to fight for a justice the town had long since forgotten. The return to redemption was a pilgrimage of ghosts. They walked the dusty miles in reverse, the harsh landscape that had been their enemy now a silent witness to their resolve. Ethan felt a strange calm settle over him. Without his gun, he was forced to rely on something else, the clarity of his purpose. Anawa walked beside him, not as a follower, but as an equal. Her presence was a source of quiet strength, a reminder of what they were fighting for. They arrived at dawn, when the sky was a soft, pearly gray and the town was still asleep. The main street was empty, the mud from the distant storm having been baked by the sun into a cracked, hard-pan surface. It looked exactly the same, yet everything was different. They walked past the livery, past the assayer's office, and stopped in the very spot where it had all begun. Their presence did not go unnoticed for long. A curtain twitched. A door creaked open. The news spread like a virus. They're back. The town slowly came to life, not with the morning bustle of commerce, but with a wary, fearful curiosity. People gathered on the boardwalks, their faces a mixture of confusion and hostility. Then, a figure emerged from the marshal's office. It was Jedediah Kane. He was not dead. He was battered, his arm in a crude sling, his face a mask of livid bruises and raw hatred. He had survived, clinging to a log, fueled by pure spite. Behind him stood Marshal Withers and a handful of other men who had either returned before him or not joined the posse at all. "There he is!" Kane roared, his voice raw. "The murderer! He led my men into that flood, killed them all." He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Ethan. "He and his savage witch," the crowd murmured, their fear easily turning to anger. Kane's lie was simple, powerful, and it confirmed their darkest prejudices. Ethan was the outsider, the killer. Anawa was the demonic catalyst. Ethan did not move. He did not shout. He simply stood his ground, his hands open at his sides. "That's a lie, Kane," he said, his voice calm and carrying in the morning air. "You know what happened in that canyon, and everyone here knows what happened in this street." He looked from face to face in the crowd, the blacksmith, the store owner, the men who had laughed and jeered. You all saw it. You saw a girl, alone and unarmed, being tormented for your sport. You saw her grandfather struck down. You saw the truth. Don't let this man's hatred make you forget it. "He's twisting things," Kane spat, his good hand reaching for the pistol at his belt. "Don't listen to him. He's the killer." It was then that Anawa stepped forward. She stood beside Ethan, but her attention was not on Kane. It was on the townsfolk, the women who had watched from their windows, the men who had stood by and done nothing. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the whisper from the canyon. It was clear, strong, and resonant with a power they had never heard before. "My name is Anawa," she began, her gaze sweeping across them. "My people have lived in these lands since before the first stone of your town was laid. We have harmed none of you. My grandfather came to trade, to offer peace. You met him with violence. You met me with hatred." She held up her arms, showing the fading bruises, the torn dress she still wore as a testament. "Look at me. Is this the image of a witch? Or is this the image of your own cruelty? This man," she said, gesturing to Ethan, "did not fire a shot in anger. He fired a shot for decency, a decency none of you could find in your own hearts." A profound silence fell over the street. Her words, simple and true, were more powerful than any bullet. They cut through the lies, through the prejudice, and laid bare the town's ugly soul. The people in the crowd looked at each other, then at the ground, shame beginning to dawn on their faces. They had seen it. They knew she was right. Kane saw his power over them dissolving. The narrative was slipping from his grasp. With a final desperate roar of rage, he drew his pistol and aimed it at Anawa. "I'll silence you for good." But he never fired. A gunshot cracked through the air, not from Kane, and not from Ethan. Marshal Withers, his face pale and his hand trembling, stood with his own pistol smoking, a look of utter shock on his face. Kane stared down at the red blossom on his chest, a look of disbelief on his face, before he crumpled to the dust. Withers looked at Ethan and Anawa, then at the silent townspeople. "She's right," the marshal said, his voice barely a whisper, yet heard by all. "We all saw it. We were all wrong. The spell of hate was broken." In the quiet aftermath, as the dust began to settle once more on the street of redemption, the truth had finally found its voice. Justice hadn't come from the barrel of Ethan's gun, but from the courage of a girl who refused to be silenced, and the conscience of a town finally forced to face the echo of its own sins. The sun climbed higher, its light no longer feeling like a hammer, but like a bomb. The town of Redemption did not celebrate. There was no cheering, only a deep, collective shame that was the first, painful step toward something better. One by one, the townspeople retreated into their homes, leaving Ethan and Anawa standing alone in the quiet street with the body of the man who had embodied their hate. They did not stay. There was nothing for them there. Ethan retrieved his horse, Pilgrim, from the livery, the stable owner avoiding his gaze and refusing payment. Anawa found her grandfather's belongings at the trading post, the trader pressing the sack of flour and medicine into her hands with a mumbled apology. They rode out of town, heading east, toward the rising sun and the lands of her people. They didn't look back. The town and its ghosts were behind them. Ethan felt the deep ache in his soul, the one he had carried for years, begin to ease. He had not erased his past, but he had finally atoned for it. He had not stood by. He had stood for something. He looked at Anawa, riding gracefully beside him, her face turned toward the horizon, toward home. Her quiet strength had been a mirror, forcing him to see the man he could be. He had thought he was saving her, but in the end, they had saved each other. Their future was as vast and uncertain as the landscape before them, but they would face it together. Their bond, forged in violence, tempered in the wilderness, and tested by fire and flood, was now a quiet certainty. The West was a harsh and unforgiving place, a land that could break a person's body and spirit, but it was also a place of immense beauty and endless possibility. It was a place where, sometimes, against all odds, a single act of courage could ripple outwards, where a quiet voice could drown out a hateful mob, and where a man could find his soul. In the vast, silent expanse of the American West, kindness was not a weakness. It was the last and strongest fortress.